Typically, when people talk about the Resident Evil series, you'll hear of games like Resident Evil 4 or the many remakes, and because of that, there are a few titles that fall through the cracks. Some, understandably so, and some kind of surprisingly. In this video, I'll be talking about the release where Capcom mixed the horror of Resident Evil and the horrors of the ocean, combining these elements into a surprisingly atmospheric game. Personally, I've always been terrified of the deep blue and what lurks beneath it, but I think that's what makes it so fascinating for me and many others. A title like this is just so compelling, so when I first played this game years ago, I was interested to see what it had to offer as nobody really talked about it. After revisiting it and experiencing its highs and lows, I've gathered my thoughts on what really works and what really doesn't. From terrifying sea monsters and derelict ships, let's talk about the game that is
Resident Evil Revelations.
Without diving too deep into the story, the tale of Resident Evil Revelations is about as Resident Evil as it gets. We get the classic Jill looking for Chris type scenario, and when an RE title has both of my favorite characters in the same game, I'm already interested. We start off the game as Jill boards a seemingly derelict cruise ship to search for a supposedly captured Chris, but end up fighting monstrosities and uncovering the evil doings of the bioterrorism group Veltro. The story itself is fine, and to be honest, I found it to be pretty campy and enjoyable. This game also introduces a new bioweapon known as the T-Abyss virus that's mainly aimed towards mutation of marine life, and is honestly a focus that I personally love. The setting is one that I also love as it takes place back in 2006, just 2 years after the events of Resident Evil 4 and 3 years before Resident Evil 5. This decade or so of time really serves as our protagonist's prime, so it's nice when we get to look back at some of their many expeditions. Alongside the familiar Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield, the game introduces a wide variety of cliche yet fun characters, and while they are very reminiscent of their time, they are pretty fun to engage with. We have Jessica as the overly flirtatious babe, Keith and Quint as our comedic relief, Parker as our basic partner fill-in, and Morgan Lansdale as the obviously evil CEO man. Chris and Jill act as they always have, which is a weird thing to be rare, and their interactions with the side characters are well done. But there was one dynamic that stood out to me particularly and might genuinely be one of my favorite things I've ever seen in Resident Evil. Jessica spends a majority of the game trying to flirt with Chris, and he just shuts her down every single time. Chris is just so genuinely chatted out that he only cares about saving Jill while treating Jessica like he wouldn't touch her with the 10-foot pole.
So, Jill, was it?
Was what? Stay focused.
She was your partner before, right?
Yeah, my partner from before. What about it?
I was, just asking.
Thanks. I'll be okay.
Sorry to bring this up again, but
Bring what up?
do you trust me as much as Jill?
There's no need to compare. I trust you both. Besides, trust is built through actions, not words.
That's so like you, Chris. It's always about the job, isn't it?
The ship doesn't have much longer. We can't let this virus contaminate the sea.
We've already searched the Queen Semiramis, so I think I know where this ship's lab is.
Everything here is just so early 2000s, and at times it's hard to take seriously, but overall offers something I appreciate as a title in the series. One thing you can't take away from this title is that if you love Chris or Jill, you will certainly get your fix with Revelations. This game just has a ton of charm, and if you enjoyed this era of gaming like I did, you will find a lot to love. Considering the era of this game and the fact that this was the time the series was entering its action-heavy focus, I found this Resident Evil to actually be one of the scarier ones. Looking past some of the more over-the-top action segments, this game still provided a good amount of horror. The main set piece being the Queen Zenobia is a fantastic location on its own, and does a lot of the heavy lifting for the fear factor of this title. Upon boarding this derelict ship, you find yourself wandering through claustrophobic corridors and dimly lit rooms, with that feeling of dread instantly setting in. The feeling of being alone is not only amplified by the fact that you're in the middle of the ocean, but also by the fact that this luxurious cruise ship is completely void of human life. The only signs of humanity being the horribly mutated corpses and state of distress everything was left in. The The Queen Zenobia itself is also gorgeous despite its horrific nature and really carries on that traditional aspect of the franchise. The emptiness aboard a ship that's supposed to be crowded with laughter and joy makes you feel uneasy, and with all of these elements pieced together, I think the main location of this game is actually one of my favorites in the series. There were a lot of small areas aboard the ship that will stick with me just because how memorable they are, and it's something that I really loved about this game. Nowadays, architecture and environmental design are a lot more grounded, and while that isn't inherently a bad thing, it often makes them a lot more forgettable. I personally loved how game designers over a decade ago would design things in a more non-traditional sense just because they looked cooler or more interesting, and many series have taken that realism route as time goes on. The sound design here is also surprisingly strong and mixes so well with the visuals in this title. I think it does a phenomenal job, whether it's keeping you nervous about what's hiding around the next corner or simply serving as an introduction to the next area you've entered. Reaching the promenade for the first time, you are met with some of the creepiest sound design I've heard in any RE title, and it serves as an incredibly disturbing setup for what's to come. Little moments like this can be found at multiple points throughout the game, and I was really impressed with how well done the atmosphere was. I honestly think Capcom did a great job at taking advantage of this location, especially considering that it likely didn't get the budget of a mainline title, and the fact that it's over 13 years old. Things like walking in waist-deep water or swimming through the flooded lower sections of the ship are all things that trigger that uh-oh response in your body. Unfortunately, the locations of the game outside of the cruise ship are a stark contrast to the atmospheric horror the Queen Zenobia is full of. These sections of the game aren't really scary at all, and I guess maybe they aren't really supposed to be. One of the more major locations being a snowy mountain is, well, just a snowy mountain, and the other location taking place in the FBC headquarters during the Terra Grigia Panic. Now, this location is certainly more memorable than the snow location, and I really do like the idea of evacuating the building during this major event. But if you watched my other Resident Evil videos, you know how I feel about hunters, and these external areas are ruined by being absolutely saturated with them. They are for some reason almost entirely used for any location outside of the ship, and I never found them to be anything more than annoying. Overall, the Queen Zenobia is definitely the star of this game, and if it was the sole location of this title, I honestly wouldn't really have any complaints. I found it to be incredibly atmospheric, and I do think it deserves praise. Going into the character design of Resident Evil Revelations, I honestly found a lot to like. Starting off with Jill, we get a tactical dive suit, which adds onto the list of her appearances that I absolutely love. While this is the look she has for the majority of the game, Revelations does something pretty cool and changes her and our other protagonists' outfits throughout the story. We get her BSAA outfit, which is personally my all-time favorite look for her, and as her standout costume, we even get Pirate Jill. Chris also gets a similar treatment with a total of 3 outfits, providing another one of my favorite looks in the series. His snow uniform looks great, and I honestly think it's a shame we don't get to see much of it before switching to his diving outfit later on to the game. His diving outfit is a little boring and isn't as good as Jill's, but honestly I don't care, as I will shamelessly admit that I fangirl a little bit over this Chris every time I see him. Speaking on his standout costume, I'm absolutely not the target demographic for this look, but cheers to those of you who feel otherwise. At least everyone gets to eat. Moving on from the big two and getting onto the supporting cast, they also get alternating outfits throughout the game, so let's go over them. Our side characters' designs vary from more generic to unique, but ultimately follow the design philosophy of just making things look cool, which I personally love. Parker, which is Jill's partner fill-in, feels pretty bland overall, and is probably my least favorite character in the game. He doesn't do much to stand out in the cast, and I don't find his appearance to aid in that lack of interest. I just feel like the game really wanted you to care for him without really giving you a reason to do so. On to Keith and Quint, which we briefly play as in specific episodes of this game. We see them in some typical soldier attire, and a cool standout outfit for Keith. Capcom should have never stopped doing these over-the-top costumes, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't miss them. Finally, on to Jessica. I think she has the best outfits in the game. She's kind of just serving in every outfit, and that energy is always welcome in my Resident Evil games. Honestly, I just can't express enough how much I love having multiple costumes for all the playable characters, and with 11 total outfits to choose from, I'm left feeling very satisfied. Going into our common enemies and unique creatures that have been created by the T-Abyss virus, let's talk about the enemy designs. The mob type enemy known as the Ooze have 4 common variations that you'll deal with on the Queen Zenobia, and in reality don't have much diversity between them. I do think the designs themselves are actually pretty disturbing, especially with the way they walk or idle, but the lack of visual variety can definitely feel a bit repetitive. Purely from a design standpoint, I do like the way they look. I just think they maybe should have had shredded crew uniforms or civilian attire to add some immersion or aid in the lack of diversity. The more less welcome but otherwise rare enemies we come across are the well-known mutated mutts that go by the Fenrir, the helicopter-handed insta-killing enemies known as the Wall Blisters, and the armored enemies known as the Scarmaglione. Sounds like a Pokemon name, I don't know. I've never been particularly fond of the iconic Resident Evil dogs, and sure, they look cool here, but ultimately don't add anything new to the franchise. As for these assholes, I feel like they kinda just look silly while being frustrating to fight. At least they do have a pretty gruesome death animation, which I always enjoy. The armored enemies really aren't all that scary either, but transform based on how you incapacitate them, which is a cool concept nonetheless. The underwater sections also do feature special enemies, being the Gyozo, which are essentially zombie piranhas, and the sea creepers, which look kind of like, anyways, my absolute bottom picks for the mob enemies are the Globsters, whose name I do kinda love, and the abhorrently overused Hunters. I will hold this stance until the day I die that Hunters are the most boring enemies in the entire franchise, and I'd rather do an arcade-style on-the-rails section over fighting waves of Hunters any day. The bosses of this game do introduce some unique designs that are a lot more memorable, with one of my standouts being the Skagdead. The build-up for its introduction is just so well done, with you entering the promenade and slowly making your way closer to it as it groans Mayday, Mayday. I love how you find it locked away in its office trying to burst out of the chains and hesitantly forcing yourself to release it was just so surprisingly tense. I could feel my heart dipping into my ass. I could feel my heart dipping into my ass while I was running away from it and hearing its saw hand spinning right behind me. The boss was very disturbing to say the least, and it looked disgusting, so I'd say it was pretty well done. My other standout boss has to be Rachel Ooze. She initially serves as a behind-the-scenes protagonist with a great introduction, where we find her early on in the game being murdered by a group of infected. Visiting the same location later on in the game reveals that her corpse is missing, leaving nothing behind but a disturbing note revealing her descent to madness, and finally an ambush. I found her to be incredibly creepy, and diabolical, hear me out, as she also falls into the category of bosses that speak. During the 3 encounters you have with her, she will stalk you and try to catch you by surprise while giggling and giving extremely disturbing dialogue. One of these encounters are completely missable, and while I unfortunately didn't get it on video, I did ultimately have to change my pants the first time around. I like both her mutated and unmutated looks, and you even get to play as her in the raid mode, which I think is super cool considering how memorable she is. I really do wish she had a bit more story in the game before becoming an enemy, but unfortunately Rachel Foley will remain mostly a mystery. The final boss of this game also has a pretty cool design, essentially appearing as the T-Abyss variant of a tyrant. This creature honestly looks pretty intimidating, and while the fear factor isn't at an all-time high, I still like it and think it's relatively fine as our final encounter. I saved these next 2 bosses for last because I don't particularly like their design and feel. Starting with the Dragonazo, this thing is literally just this big bulky clump of shell and really just fits into the most forgettable category of boss. Its overall shape is just hard to read, and I never really got the thought of this looks cool while fighting it. Lastly, and just a tiny bit better than the last guy, is the Malakota. This is the largest enemy in the game, and I think it was extremely underutilized. Its design on its own is fine and not exactly revolutionary, but it just doesn't really build up the ore that it should have. I would have loved to see shots of it swimming beneath the ship, and as much as I hate this idea, maybe a section where you're actually in the water with it. All of its interactions are super arcadey and don't utilize the fact that it's actually a pretty terrifying BOW. Overall, the character and creature design of this title is a bit of a mixed bag with a lot of love and a lot to forget. I love the fact that our entire cast gets alternate outfits, and I think a lot of the enemies are still pretty good. I just feel like some of them are lackluster and overstayed their welcome. Oh, and also, while this character isn't playable in the story, we do get to play as Lady Hunk in the raid mode, and even though this is incredibly stupid, I love it. You can tell Capcom was just having fun with this title, and I completely respect that. So this section is really to cover the ugliest side of this game. Resident Evil Revelations, despite coming out after Resident Evil 5, somehow feels much more clanky and even frustrating to play. The aiming feels horrible, the movement is awkward, and unfortunately, no matter what you change in the settings, your sensitivity will either be too high or not high enough.
I might be able to shoot it off.
Oh god. Getting into the combat itself, Revelations introduces the dodge mechanic, which isn't something completely alien to the series, but it does work. Sometimes. But most of this is somewhat forgivable. What isn't forgivable, on the other hand, is the boss fights. The amount of bullets you have to just absolutely pump into every single boss encounter is downright horrendous, and honestly kills any of the scariness because it's all replaced by frustration. Every fight feels like it drags on for an eternity, and while long boss fights aren't inherently bad, the gameplay itself isn't exactly riveting enough to make it feel exciting. The encounters are pretty much run, shoot, until you've used all your ammo. And don't die or you'll have to repeat the last 10 minutes you spent to get this enemy down to 50% of its health. Oh, and remember that dodge mechanic I mentioned earlier which works sometimes? Yeah, there's a boss built entirely around that mechanic for some reason, where you pretty much just run around a big room dodging it over and over again, and shooting it slowly. It's pretty much every other boss fight, but with extra steps that make it feel, well, even longer. I truly wish I could say this was just one or even two of the bosses, but it's literally every single one, and I can't bring myself to defend it. Outside of the boss fights, the game really does feel fine despite its shortcomings. You do eventually get used to the janky movements, and when you actually manage to land a well-timed dodge, it feels pretty good. In terms of new-ish mechanics, this game is the first to add actual swimming and also introduces the Genesis scanner. You essentially use the Genesis to find hidden items around the map and gain research points from scanning enemies. I mostly feel indifferent to this specific mechanic, but it did ultimately get carried over into Revelations 2 as a staple of these titles. It sucks to say, but the gameplay aspect of Revelations is unfortunately its biggest downside. I don't think it absolutely ruins the game, but I do think it holds it back from being what I would consider to be a great game. This title is far from the worst I've played, but this definitely isn't a game I'd recommend for its gameplay, but rather what it has to offer in the series. Ultimately, Resident Evil Revelations is a bit of a mixed bag in terms of the franchise's releases, and oddly enough, is held back mostly by the gameplay itself. I really do think this game has a lot to adore, with things like playing with Chris and Jill, a fun raid mode, and a campy but interesting story. I in no way can call this game a masterpiece, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy it, and honestly, I think this is a great title for fans of this series that just want to see more of their favorite characters or go back to the simpler times. While I do think Revelations has many flaws, I would still consider it to be underrated, and really just wanted to show it some love where it was deserved. This entry just feels so nostalgic for me, with its graphics, art design, and the fact that this is the last game we get to play with what to me feels like classic Jill. And I do think it's interesting how rarely it's talked about. Hell, I feel like I've heard more people talk about Dead Aim. But this is gonna wrap up my video on Revelations, and if you liked it, feel free to check out my other videos on the channel where I cover many games both old and new. If you want to show some extra love, feel free to check my art out through the links in the description, and also let me know how you guys felt about this game down in the comments. Until next time, thanks for watching.